Uh, my name's David Poultney. I'm the minister here. I'm to channel my inner flight attendant and point out where the lavatories are. In 2 minutes' time, we'll all be back to normal, but for the present, they are out the back door. If you talk to the gentleman in the corner, he's got his hand up. He will show you if you need to go there in the next hour or so. This is a part of our education series. It's part of our commitment to public theology. We've been doing this for some time, and I think for very good reasons we decided to name this program for the late Colin Gibson, who would be very proud, I think, the way that some of our issues have been engaged with in this forum. So I'm going to pass you over to George to introduce our speaker.
For those of you who are new to this event, Colin Gibson was our organist, choir master, hymnologist, general factotum of the church for many, many years, and his name is emblazoned on the organ that he used to play. He also conducted the education evenings, which David has mentioned. Yeah, by the way, my name's George Davis. I'm the sort of convener of this little lot. Colin's series, we had series 1 last year, which turned out to be very successful. We had 5 meetings, most of them well attended, apart from the one I took, which was the first one. This is series 2. Here we are in July, and we are going to have in August, Professor Murray Ray. Royden Somerville's coming back again to pronounce on AI and the threat posed by AI. And Richard Egan is going to be taking the last for the year in November. So look out for those. Robert, what do I say apart from welcome?
Thank you.
I have a long shorthand notes. Most of you might know that Robert is Professor of International Relations and the inaugural sesquicentennial, I had to be careful about how I said that.
Means 150.
Distinguished Chair, 150th year in 2019 at OU. Former Head of Department of Politics. He is the author of, the reference says, 12 scholarly works. It might be more now.
14, actually.
14. I thought I might stand corrected. 14. He's a co-editor for the Prager series on ethics on American foreign policy and is editor for the Journal of International Studies Perspectives. For this address in 2018, he had published through World Scientific Publishing in 2018, a book, New Zealand and the World, Past, Present and Future. So you can see he's a historian, an observer and a seer. I won't say a soothsayer. He's a luminary in the world of political studies, a Fulbright senior scholar, an honorary professor of the New Zealand Defence Force Command and the Trentham Staff College. He's also up to date, not quite up to date, in the YouTube channel and with LinkedIn contacts. That's enough from me. So over to you, Robert. Welcome.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I was relieved I found this. It was one of those locations where I thought I knew and discovered I wasn't so smart after all. I wondered, George, if I could trouble you for a glass of water. I've recently got over a heavy cold, not COVID, just a heavy cold, and it's left me, a bit dry. George handed me a very nice cartoon when I arrived of Christopher Luxon sitting on the fence. And he said, I don't think people fully realise how difficult it's maintained this position and of course on the fence is the Middle East. And the title of my presentation today is Sitting on the Fence, New Zealand's Stance Towards Gaza and the Israel-Iran conflict during the second Trump administration. For those of you who read my occasional pieces in the media, there will be nothing new. But I hope to bring together and make the case that while New Zealand is distant in geographical terms from the Middle East, the brutal violence that we've seen in Gaza, the West Bank, and more recently Iran, marks the latest stage in the unravelling of an international rules-based order on which New Zealand has traditionally depended for its prosperity and its security in the post-45 era. In short, we actually have a big stake in what is happening, particularly with the trashing of international law that's occurring. Rules are there for the weak, not for the strong. And so we are not detached observers when we see those rules being dispensed with impunity by various actors in the Middle East. Now, it should be emphasised that New Zealand's founding document, the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, emphasises partnership and cooperation at home. And after 1945, particularly I think from the 1980s, I think that vision of what Waitangi should be, the Treaty of Waitangi should be, began to inspire a New Zealand worldview which was enshrined in institutions such as the United Nations and norms such as multilateralism. It's a sort of a thread that runs through New Zealand's foreign policy for much of the post-45 period, starting off with Peter Fraser, who played such a big role in the drafting of the UN Charter. Of course, Peter Fraser was Prime Minister between 1940 and 1949. And as the Russians like to say, it was no coincidence that it was a New Zealand Prime Minister who was quite active in drafting the UN Charter, because we perceived, quite correctly, that our vision of how the world should be included rules, procedures and principles. In the wake of Hamas's terrorist attacks in Israel on the 7th of October 2023, the national-led coalition government has, in principle, emphasised its support for a lasting ceasefire in Gaza and for the need for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, the conflict is over the occupied territories, Israeli-occupied territories of East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. So, in principle, and if you follow New Zealand diplomacy in the UN since that appalling terrorist attack, it's quite clear that New Zealand broke with the other members of the Five Eyes on the 27th of October 2023. It was the only Western country, apart from, I think, Ireland and perhaps Spain, that voted for an immediate humanitarian truce. So we were actually opposing the position taken by many of our allies, including the United States, in the UN. So this was the approach, in principle, that New Zealand adopted in the UN. And by December 2023, New Zealand was joined by Australia and Canada. And in the following year, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia issued 2 joint statements calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. However, it's got to be said that the New Zealand position, the New Zealand stance towards these conflicts in the Middle East has been somewhat ambivalent. correct in principle, but in practice, the New Zealand stance has not always translated into firm diplomatic opposition to Netanyahu's government's quest, and it makes no secret of it. The new Netanyahu's government has made it quite clear that it wants to control Gaza, and also in the latter part of last year made it clear that the far-right coalition government led by Mr. Netanyahu intends to annex the West Bank in the course of 2025. Nor has New Zealand condemned the Trump administration's desire to prioritise its support for Israel's security goals over international law. Now, to be fair, this is not just the Trump administration that has prioritised support for Israel's security goals over international law. The Biden administration, from the evening of the 7th of October 2023, gave almost unconditional support to Netanyahu's campaign, and Netanyahu called it on the 8th of October a campaign of mighty vengeance in Gaza. So I'm not trying to put all the blame at Mr. Trump's feet. The Biden administration constantly complained about the high level of civilian casualties in Gaza and the West Bank, but didn't complain to the point where they started holding back arms to Israel, which enabled that violence. 4/5 of the munitions used by Israel in Gaza have been provided by the United States. Foreign Minister Winston Peters has described the situation in Gaza as, quote, simply intolerable. He's also described it in a hard-hitting speech in April 2024 in the UN as a catastrophe, and he blamed the UN Security Council for failing in its formal responsibilities to uphold global peace and security, although he did not identify the actor on the UN Security Council that had used the veto to perpetuate the conflict. In short, the national-led coalition government has had little specific to say as the Netanyahu government has resumed its cruel blockade of humanitarian aid to Gaza in March of this year, and quickly thereafter restarted military operations there. So we had a brief ceasefire in January as Mr. Trump took office in the White House, and by early March, that precarious ceasefire had broken down. Israel had unilaterally withdrawn from the agreement that it had signed with Hamas, through the mediation of the United States and also Qatar. Even more striking to me was the national-led government's coalition's silence on President Trump's outlandish proposal to own Gaza with a view to evicting 2 million Palestinian residents from that territory. We've also seen that Mr. Trump retreated from that initial, what he called serious proposal. He now says it's just a recommendation. But more seriously, the United States and Israel initiated what can only be described as a start-up venture known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in late May of this year, a move which sidelined the United Nations in terms of aid distribution in Gaza, and has led, as many of you will be following, to the killing of more than 800 Palestinians while seeking food aid. And those of you who follow the situation in the last 24 hours will know that close to 100 Palestinians have been killed trying to get food in the last 24 hours. I was shocked that the government didn't say anything about this. We've always been a staunch supporter for the impartial role of the UN in conflict situations. Our silence is deafening. Two very interested parties, the United States and Israel, have taken over complete control of the distribution of food in Gaza. And it's naive to believe there's not a political agenda by the way that's being handled. When UNRWA, the United Nations Specialized Agency for Distributing Relief and Support in Palestine, was involved in the distribution of aid, and before the conflict there were 300 feeding stations. There are now 4, and that's going to be reduced to 1 very shortly. And you can imagine, for a population of 2 million people in a very densely populated territory, that makes it very difficult indeed. There's a number of people, the Lancet Journal, for example, a serious journal, have been writing and observing about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Some people are simply not getting enough to eat. And they're prepared to take enormous risks to get food. I should point out that New Zealand, along with the UK, Australia, Canada and Norway, did impose sanctions on 2 far-right Israeli government ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, on the 10th of June for what our government said was inciting extremist violence against the Palestinians. That was not only just violence against Gazans, but also in the West Bank. And by the way, although this was a relatively modest measure, and I'll explain why shortly, the Trump administration criticised New Zealand and the other countries that put these limited sanctions against just 2 members of the government of Israel. In my view, this move to sanction Smotrich and Ben-Gvir was a case of very little, very late. In the last 21 months, yes, that's how long the conflict's been going on. In the last 21 months, Gaza has been the scene of what an American Catholic theologian, Thomas Merton, once called the unspeakable. Human wrongdoing on a scale and a depth that seems to go beyond the capacity of words to adequately describe. That's what Merton meant when he used the term the unspeakable. And we're living through times of the unspeakable. And that is why so many young people are feeling extremely angry and frustrated that many of our elected politicians, and not just in this country, but in many of the liberal democracies, do not seem to grasp the gravity of the situation. The Hamas terror attacks of the 7th of October 2023 killed around 1,200 Israelis, but the Netanyahu's government's retaliation involving the Israeli Defense Force against Hamas, ostensibly against Hamas, has resulted in the deaths of more than 56,000 Palestinians in the last 21 months, 70% of whom were women and children. 20,000 people under the age of 12 have been killed in what's called an anti-terrorist campaign. If you've ever had the opportunity, and I'm very privileged I have, interviewing senior military people who have responsibility for conducting counter-terrorism, the first thing they will tell you is that you must target very precisely those who are responsible for a terrorist act, and you must go to extraordinary lengths to protect the civilians who may have no connection with Hamas. And unfortunately, that care has not been taken. Over the same period, and it's important to bear this in mind, more than 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank as Israel accelerated its program of illegal settlements there. And why do I use that phrase, illegal settlements? Because that is the judgment of the International Court of Justice. It produced an advisory ruling. in June last year, and New Zealand fully endorsed it. It voted for it in the United Nations General Assembly. And what did it mean? According to the ICJ, the Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem, which was unilaterally annexed in 1980, as well as the occupation of Gaza, as well as the occupation of the West Bank, are unlawful. And that's the position the New Zealand government holds. Now, in addition, the responses of the national government to preemptive attacks by Israel between the 3rd and the 25th of June, the so-called 12-day war, and the fact that that Trump's America on the 22nd of June joined in against Iran to destroy ostensibly to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. I found the responses of the New Zealand government to these twin attacks, joint attacks on Iran, as strangely ambivalent. We shouldn't have any illusions about the repressive regime in Tehran. At the same time, we should not close our eyes to certain facts. What are the facts? Well, there were clear indications from US intelligence in the shape of Tulsi Gabbard's statements, Director of Intelligence in the United States, and also the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Both of those agencies, US intelligence and the IAEA has been inspecting Iran until recently on a very regular basis. While Iran had complaints, while the IAEA had complaints about Iran's enrichment level, it found absolutely no evidence that Iran was on the verge of producing a nuclear weapon. And that is the findings of US intelligence. And they haven't retracted that finding, by the way. So what we have here then are attacks against Iran on the grounds that it was on the verge of developing nuclear weapons. The only problem was that the international body that's been inspecting Iran on a regular basis disagrees, and also US intelligence disagrees. Nevertheless, Mr. Peters said New Zealand was not prepared to take a position on this issue. That is to say, we may not like the government of Iran, but that doesn't give us the right to launch a preemptive attack against it. That's a flagrant violation of international law. But Mr. Peters, citing provocative behaviour by what he said was both Iran and Israel, Mr. Peters adopted what he said was a neutral stance towards the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. With respect to the attacks by the United States on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz and Isfahan, the current New Zealand government seems to have echoed the view of Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, that said that the US attacks were entirely consistent with international law. Which, by the way, was, in my view, that was strategically a disastrous statement for the NATO Secretary General to make, because the whole case of resisting Russian invasion is because it is a violation of international law. And so for the Secretary General to demonstrate that he's being very selective about what international laws he's prepared to deem as acceptable actually undermines the support for a government which is out facing desperate times in Kyiv. Foreign Minister Peters and Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour have reiterated Iran could not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. And they tacitly supported the US decision to bomb nuclear facilities in Iran. Now just think about this for a second. Iran said, before the negotiations were broken off by the Israeli attack on Iran, the chief Iranian negotiator was interviewed on Al Jazeera 2 weeks before his death and said he was optimistic that Iran would forego permanently the development of nuclear weapons in order to get sanctions lifted by the Trump administration, and for the Trump administration to possibly help them develop nuclear energy for peaceful generation purposes. In short, as he said in the interview, we're seeking what Germany and Japan do, developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Now, of course, you may say, well, that's incredibly naive. We couldn't believe a word the Iranian government has said. But if you have to test people at their words. Unfortunately, the Israeli attacks on Iran meant that the diplomatic process was interrupted before we could find out whether Iran was in fact genuine or not on that issue. It should be recalled, however, it was the Trump administration which had contributed to this problem, the first Trump administration, because it withdrew from the US-Iran nuclear deal, which was initialed in 2013 and ratified in 2015. Under that deal, sanctions were lifted against Iran largely, but not entirely, by the EU and the United States, in return for Iran effectively foregoing the development of nuclear weapons for the indefinite future. But when Mr. Trump came in, he said he could get a better deal. Unfortunately, he didn't. And so we continue to have this problem. Mr. Peters noted that the Trump administration's targeted attacks were aimed at, quote, degrading Iran's nuclear capabilities, unquote, and acknowledged that the US's statement to the UN Security Council claiming these attacks were taken, these Mr. Peters' words, not mine, quote, in collective self-defense consistent with the UN Charter, unquote. So from Mr. Peters' point of view, the US bombing of those three nuclear facilities in Iran was consistent with the UN Charter. I think that's quite a novel interpretation, but we can take that up in questions. So if you piece together the New Zealand government's approach to the conflicts we're witnessing in Gaza, the West Bank, and also its response to the attacks by Israel, the preemptive attacks by Israel and the United States. And by the way, Iran has not got nuclear weapons, but Israel and the United States do. So two nuclear armed powers conducted preemptive attacks. But if we piece together the New Zealand government's response to these interrelated issues, it becomes clear, I believe, that while New Zealand has been quite principled in the UN, outside the UN, in the wider international arena, it's gone to extraordinary lengths not to offend the Trump administration. And this, in turn, has compromised New Zealand's commitment to uphold an international rules-based order, which Mr. Luxon has repeatedly said they are absolutely committed to. To be clear, Israel's conduct in Gaza is clearly at odds with its legal responsibilities as an occupying power. And the preemptive attacks by nuclear-armed Israel and America on Iran cannot be justified legally when the clerical regime, and it's abhorrent and repressive, sure. Nevertheless, the clerical regime in Tehran at the moment does not have nuclear weapons, and the diplomatic process had not been exhausted. In fact, it was Israel that disrupted the diplomatic process. Many of you will be aware that US and Iranian negotiators were due to meet on the Sunday 2 days after the initiation of the attacks by Israel on Iran. Now, of course, some observers, and that includes some of my colleagues, maintain that a relatively small state like New Zealand has no choice but to tacitly accept flagrant violations of international law when they're committed by big, powerful friends like Trump's America. However, such a perspective, in my view, underestimates or understates the capacity of small countries and middle powers to shape what is increasingly an interconnected world. And I want you to think about that for a second. What we're seeing at the moment is a lack of global leadership. Yes, we're seeing renewed geopolitical competition between the two most powerful countries in the world, but neither of those countries can unilaterally solve the world's problems. The problems that are facing superpowers, middle powers, small powers, they're too big to be solved unilaterally. We're talking about climate change, transnational terrorism, pandemics, financial contagion, which doesn't recognise borders. In short, we're living a world in the 21st century which can't be run by superpowers. If they could, they would, but they cannot. So all this deference to superpowers, in my view, needs some sort of perspective. And it should be remembered that in the past, New Zealand has stood up for what it believed to be correct and justified internationally. In 2003, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Helen Clark, bravely refused to support an illegal US invasion of Iraq, and the wisdom of that stance was subsequently confirmed in what was a disastrous military adventure for the George W. Bush administration. Moreover, New Zealand's leadership in promoting the 2021 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has now been ratified by more than 73 states, means that New Zealand should have a strong voice on the military actions by Israel and the Trump team that have effectively incentivized Iran to develop nuclear weapons. If you were sitting in Iran, or Tehran I should say, one lesson you would derive from the preemptive attacks by the United States and Israel, if we had nuclear weapons, this wouldn't have occurred. If anything has incentivized Iran to get nuclear weapons, it's those illegal preemptive attacks. How has New Zealand responded to the lawless and escalating conflicts in the Middle East? Well, we've heard the government is not rushing to judgment because, as Mr. Seymour put it, going off half-cocked can be very costly for a small nation, unquote. So that's the government's position. They're not going to rush to judgment. They believe that any assessment would be premature. In fact, one of the refrains that we've heard from government ministers for much of the last 21 months is wait and see. So, in a sense, not only is that defeatist, but it's reactive. It shows no willingness to say, can New Zealand make a difference? After all, New Zealand's a disinterested observer, but as I said before, we do have a big stake in the outcome. So if we reflect on the Trump administration's might is right approach and its complete indifference to international law, it seems to me that given this combination of trends, the national-led coalition government faces stark choices which is, by sitting on the fence, it has studiously tried to avoid. But by sitting on the fence, it's actually making a choice. the government continue to fudge fundamental moral and legal issues in the Middle East. But in doing so, it risks complicity in the further weakening of an international rules-based order that all New Zealand governments in the post-war period have said they support. So sitting on the fence is seen by actors, not least in the Middle East, as complicity and support for illegal actions. There's another choice. New Zealand can get off the fence. It can show that it's got a working moral compass. It can stand up, in Mr. Luxon's word, for what this country believes in, and it can insist that respect for international law must be observed in the Middle East region and elsewhere, without exception. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you. Oh, of course, yeah.
If you'd like to give a question to Professor Patman, we're going to suggest that maybe you could come up here to a microphone, if you can. If you can't and you'd like to still ask a question, then we will somehow work out a way of relaying it for you. Bit hard in my case. Because my hearing isn't all that fantastic. However, is there anybody with a question? Please come up.
I will certainly address the questions, but whether I can answer them is another matter.
I think this one you probably can answer, judging by your accent. And really that's about the position of Britain in all of this, because you know, you started off saying 75% or whatever of the arms to support Israel's action came from the US, but some of them also come from Britain.
Yeah, and Australia.
And, you know, they've kept a pretty low profile, but in general have been quite strongly supportive of Israel. And I just wonder if you could comment on the part of Britain, because increasingly, as somebody who was born in Britain, it seems to me...
Long time ago.
Yes. That Britain has been quite complicit in all of this also.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent question. Did everybody hear the question? Yes, as you can tell by my accent, although just to clarify this, I've now lived in New Zealand longer than I'd lived in Britain, the country I was born in. And when I do go back to Europe, part of my family is Dutch, my sister lives in the Netherlands and her family, British people are quite bemused by my accent. They can't work out. So my daughters describe me as a spray-on Kiwi. So the British role, in my view, has been, I try to use my words carefully, dishonourable. Britain has a huge historic responsibility in the Middle East. And all it's done is basically amplify the American position. One of the big disappointments, I think, is the fact that US administrations, because of domestic politics, are quite incapable of being even-handed when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. But other liberal democracies should be capable. One of the huge disappointments for many of us is that liberal democracies have no spine. Why didn't the Starmer administration on the 8th of October 2023, when it was quite apparent that there was the potential for disproportionate response by Israel, why did other liberal democracies, and not just Britain, Germany, perhaps because of its history, is desperate not to be seen to do anything that's could be construed as anti-Semitic. And that phrase, anti-Semitic, by the way, has been weaponised. Some of the biggest critics of the Netanyahu government are in fact Jewish, both within Israel and outside it. And but it's convenient for Netanyahu to describe any criticism of his government's policy as anti-Semitic. It reminds me of the old Soviet Union, when any criticism of the Soviet government was described as anti-Soviet. And of course, America, under Mr. Trump, likes to depict any criticism of his government's policies as anti-American. It's an intellectual cop-out, and it's not good enough. I'm just disappointed. To answer the question, I think Israel has, the United Kingdom has not lived up to its historical responsibility. It should not just be an echo of the United States, and particularly when the United States is undermining British interests, not least through imposing tariffs and also taking other steps which are not necessarily in Britain's favour. But what I have noticed, particularly since I've been in New Zealand, is that this goes back a long way. British prime ministers seem to have an inability to be anything but deferential to US presidents. And you know, if you look at Tony Blair, the Labour leader, he was doing fine until George W. Bush got into the White House. And then he just pretended he was Clinton, so he continued to agree with George W. Bush. So you had the situation where the government of Blair shipwrecked itself by supporting the illegal invasion of Iraq, which split British society. And we have a similar situation with Britain at the moment, where there's been huge demonstrations protesting against Labour's support for the Netanyahu government. It's causing serious problems within Britain and polarising the society. You're absolutely right. I don't mean to put all the blame on the United States. There's plenty of blame to go round. I'm very disappointed by the fact that other liberal democracies... And by the way, let me just repeat something that an American friend who I've known many years often says to me in correspondence and email and telephone calls. He always says to me, Rob, when are our allies going to learn that they are their most loyal when they speak up when they disagree with us? Being silent is the worst thing you can do, because for a Trump administration and for the Biden administration, they interpret that as support. And I think one of the reasons the Americans went all in was because most liberal other democracies remained quiet, not least the British. So I think, if you've got a superpower that is flagrantly breaking international law, and that hurts the interests of many of America's allies. Look, let's be quite clear. We haven't got a get-out-of-jail card like Britain. We haven't got a veto in the UN Security Council. We're not like the United States. We're not a superpower, and we don't have a veto. We depend on rules in a way that they don't. And I think it's high time that Britain and New Zealand started working with other like-minded liberal democracies to get the UN Security Council reformed. Because one thing is quite clear, the use of the veto is absolutely destabilising global security. And that's ironic because it was introduced to stabilise it.
Thank you, Professor Patman, for your insights. Just a quick reminder too that New Zealand and Australian Anzac troops were in 1917, 1918, were responsible for liberating Gaza from the Ottoman Empire. And it's something I find truly ironic considering what's happening now. But my question to you is, how do you contrast the current New Zealand government's stance on international affairs with the Longi government's stance on banning nuclear ships from entering our waters?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? It seems to me that I'll try and answer that by identifying what I believe were the key foreign policy goals of the national-led coalition government. The first goal was to become more active on the international stage, and I think none of us in this room would dispute that Mr. Peters has been quite active in travelling and meeting other leaders. The second goal was to more closely align New Zealand with traditional allies. Now, let me just be quite clear here. I found the second goal, I thought it was performative, because in substantial terms, the relationship that the national-led coalition government inherited with both Australia and the United States was better than it's been in 2 decades. The Ardern government was extremely highly rated in the US. The US went to extraordinary lengths to praise it, and Hipkins got similarly warm support. And as we saw with the demise, or departure I should say, of Scott Morrison, relations improved dramatically with Australia. So I couldn't quite get the emphasis. I think it was more performative than substantial. It has got the government into knots over things like AUKUS. The problem for the government is they're not dealing with the Biden administration. They're dealing with the Trump administration, which is on the road to autocracy. And, you know, the whole thrust of close alignment with traditional allies is based on the assumption that we're moving closer to those countries that share our basic values and interests. But it's quite clear, if our eyes are open, the Trump administration does not share New Zealand's vision of the world. Let's be quite clear about this. And I do wish the government would be clearer on it. What is Trump's vision of the world? Trump sees the world in top-down terms. It's transactional, and the world, according to Mr. Trump, should be run by great powers. And since America's the greatest of all, it will always be at the top table. And yes, Mr. Trump's idea of a well-functioning world is to cut very favourable deals with the likes of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And the three of them, with Mr. Trump calling the shots, of course, will keep everything under control. This is a vision that is indifferent, in fact, antagonistic to multilateralism, and has no time for international law. It's might is right. That is the Trump vision. And we have to be very careful about our measured response to the Trump administration, because we're in danger of undermining the things that we thought New Zealand represents internationally. And, you know, we're seeing quite serious assaults on our national interests on multiple fronts at the moment. We're seeing moves towards protectionism. We're seeing attempts to operationalise the idea that might is right, where countries which have the capabilities disregard rules and principles. I mean, let's be quite clear. If there's an international free-for-all involving the most powerful countries in the world, that will come at great cost to the rest. But the irony is, as I said before, the United States, Russia, which is after all a regional power, not a superpower, and China. China and the United States are the two superpowers in the world. And it's not because they're weak. Our superpowers today, if you want to use a boxing analogy, our heavyweights today are more muscular, they're better trained, and they punch harder than before. The problem is the ring space where they operate has contracted. So they can start throwing punches, but they get hurt in the process, a bit like fighting in a telephone booth. And the fact of the matter is, we live in a world where many of the key problems can only be solved by self-interested international cooperation. So there's every reason why countries like New Zealand, should speak out more. You asked me about how varies from the Longy government. Well, I think quite considerably, but we haven't yet. I mean, for me, the key test for the current government, it hasn't yet indicated categorically that it's rejected AUKUS. AUKUS is this enhanced security partnership between the United States, the UK, and Australia. And there's a lot of buyer's remorse going on in Australia at the moment over that arrangement. But I do think, compared with let's be quite clear, the Longy government, it's a difficult yardstick to compare subsequent governments, because the Longy government, I think, found itself in a situation that it hadn't anticipated. But it did dig in once challenged. And, I was living in Britain when that happened. And like many people, I really admired Longy. I thought this was incredible that a leader who was so articulate and quite witty would have the temerity to stand up to a superpower. And look, I'm not saying that standing up to a superpower is a good thing in itself. No, but if a country which has a relatively young foreign policy wants to inject some sovereignty in its foreign policy, and it was striking that by the end of the 80s, people in the National Party, as well as the Labour Party, as well as many other parties in this country, had come round to the view that non-nuclear security was good for New Zealand. Of course, we were influenced by the French conducting tests in the Pacific. So I hope that our country, what is the big difference? I think the Longy government articulated the vision of a country like New Zealand, which may be small, but it had a distinctive contribution to make on the international stage, and would speak up when it believed major issues were at stake. I hope we haven't lost that. But what I hear from some government ministers is a defeatist notion. I heard David Seymour saying, no one's holding their breath waiting to find out what New Zealand believes on the preemptive attacks by Israel and the United States. I thought to myself, how defeatist? It may come as a surprise to people sometimes, but many people around the world are very conscious of New Zealand. You only have to cast your mind back to the 15th of March 2019, when we had that appalling terrorist atrocity carried out by a white supremacist who killed 51 Muslim New Zealanders. Within the days after that, many people in the world, and this is not a political point, it could have been a national government, many people in the world took serious note of the way New Zealand handled that crisis. And they admired it. It was a combination of empathy and compassion, but a willingness to take decisive action. So when we do good things, we are noticed. We live in an interconnected world. This idea that we're a long way from everywhere, no one takes it notice, is completely wrong. When I heard Seymour say that, it was like hearing someone speak in the 40s. I couldn't believe it. But people notice when we are complicit and silent. They also notice when we drop the ball spectacularly as well. So, coming back to your very good question, I do think the government's in danger of a view of the world where we are small and helpless and must shelter behind a superpower. I hope that, I don't think that's fair to the government. I don't think that's the national position. I'm not sure what the position of Seymour at the ACT Party and New Zealand First is. I don't think that's the national position, because National is a major party and it doesn't want to compromise its economic relationship with China, because a major constituency of the National Party, as we all know, is the farmers. No one's keener on free trade than the farming community. I have the great privilege of speaking to groups like in Timaru and Waimate, and they're not happy about Mr. Trump's protectionism at all. And so I think, I'm not suggesting for one moment that National has given up on having a distinctive position. But I do worry about the tail wagging the dog in the coalition arrangements, where the David Seymour and Mr. Peters sometimes perhaps have more influence than they should.
Now we are. Thank you, Professor. Look, permit me an observation and what I guess is now a supplementary question, because you partly answered it by the time I made my way
Sorry, I'm
here.
a bit long-winded.
No, absolutely fine. You hold the sesquicentennial chair. The notion of sitting on the fence reminded me of a poster I had on my wall in 1990 when we celebrated our sesquicentennial, and one of the significant debates at the time was around biculturalism. Not that we seem to have moved too far, but the poster simply said, "Not to decide is to decide," and I think the fence sitting kind of fits within that. My question is around this notion of anti-Semitism. Last week, I think it was, a Jewish group within Australia challenged the Australian Prime Minister around anti-Semitism, and the Prime Minister acknowledged that and said, particularly amongst academics. A few days later, in the last couple of days, we've had ex-President Ehud Olmert from Israel very clearly saying that it is disingenuous to solely point the finger at anti-Semitism in terms of the reaction of the world against what is happening in Gaza. His point is the responsibility does not sit with the Jewish community, the responsibility sits with the Israeli government. And those are two very, very different concepts. You touched on that before. I'd appreciate if you could unpack that thought a little bit further.
Thank you for your excellent question. It seems to me that I think it was Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish, who said that let's be quite clear, anti-Semitism is real. There are people who, if you like, are hostile to anyone who is Jewish, irrespective of their Israeli or New Zealand Jewish person or whatever. And that's regrettable. More than regrettable, it's abhorrent. But it's also abhorrent to be anti-Palestinian or anti any ethnic group. And in a sense, it's the Trump administration is also playing this card. It's depicting people who are critical of the Israeli far-right government as being anti-Semitic. And I think this is a intellectual sleight of hand. I mean, it's not honest politics, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Honest politics, but makes me sound naive, doesn't it? But it seems to me dishonourable, and it's deceitful. You know, the Netanyahu government. I mean, I quoted Thomas Merton in my presentation tonight. He used the phrase actually in 1968 when he was referring to the intensive bombing that the United States was conducting in Vietnam. And we only learnt of the full consequences some time later, which were quite horrific. But, you know, it saddens me when elected politicians do not speak truth to power. And, you know, effectively by weaponising the phrase, and you're anti-Semitic if you criticise us. I mean, let's turn it round. What the Netanyahu government is demanding is complete freedom to do anything it wants, and it doesn't want any criticism. Well, I'm sorry, if you're a democratic elected government, you should be prepared for that. I mean, I'm a great disciple of Harry Truman. I wasn't around, by the way, when he was president. But he always said he had no time for politicians who used to whinge about the media. And he told one young senator who was whinging about the media, look, son, if you can't stand the heat in the kitchen, don't go in the kitchen. In other words, if you want to become a professional politician and you live in a democracy, be prepared to be kept on your toes by questions. And I think that's important. But I don't think I can add too much to what you're saying. I think it's, there have been some courageous people, and I do think, despite the very active interventions by the Netanyahu government in many liberal democracies against protesters, I do think the narrative is changing in favour of the Palestinians. If you look at the changes in the United States, the Pew Institute, which measures American public opinion, have recorded a tremendous shift in public opinion. You could argue that despite charges that anyone who supported the Palestinians was anti-Semitic, that cut no ice whatsoever amongst many young people. Why is there such a generation gulf? I think it's because many young people don't see the world in compartmentalised terms. They get their news from various sources. And also, I think, it seems to me that despite weaponising the term anti-Semitism, the Israeli government is losing the battle of ideas globally. And, the sad thing, the thing that really saddens me is that I spoke earlier about the relative silence of liberal democracies as the United States was supporting a government which was acting almost with impunity. I mean, look at the scale of the loss of life in Gaza, for example, and the West Bank. It's happening on a daily basis. But what it really saddens me is not just that those liberal democracies did not speak up against that, and therefore made American decision makers think again. That was a major thing. But it's also the fact that we don't seem to have learned from the past. I know politicians are not good at learning from history, but in a sense, one of the lessons of the 1930s was that you cannot just remain silent when fundamental norms such as respect for territorial integrity, for human rights, are just violated on a massive basis. And we all know, I think most of us in this room know the situation in Gaza and the West Bank at the moment has not been, of course, it's a complex conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But the tragedy of not speaking out is actually, I think, it's not done Israel any favours. Why do I say that? Well, let's think. We're now 21 months into this latest phase of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Has Israel's actions, its attempt to obliterate Hamas, that was always a fantasy. You cannot obliterate an idea. There's no military solution. They could exterminate every single member of Hamas, and it would not make Israel more secure. In fact, the question I'm getting to here, the failure to speak out has emboldened Israel to go further with their objectives. And that in turn has made Israel more insecure, because lots and lots of Palestinians who have absolutely no time for Hamas. I was very interested, when this conflict started, I had a very distressed student in one of my classes who was Palestinian, who was born in New Zealand, but some of her family members were visiting relatives in Gaza and they got trapped there by the conflict. So she was very distressed and we had a chat. And she said to me, very few Palestinians actually like Hamas or have any, want it to be running the authority. but she said the irony of the current situation is these actions are politically bolstering Hamas because it plays into their narrative that they're defending the Palestinian people. And, you know, the other thing that's disappointed me, so I actually think that Israel has been almost given a free hand, and it's taken actions which have actually made Israel more insecure because the amount of hatred has expanded. Imagine how any of us would feel if, just imagine a hypothetical scenario where we were living in a territory like Gaza, we detested the governing authority, which was Hamas. We had no say in the Hamas attack on Israel, which prompted this spiral. And then we saw our family members killed by Israel in retaliation. Would we be well disposed towards Israel? Of course we wouldn't. If anything, this has boosted Hamas. And that's the tragedy of the situation. One other point, much of my presentation today has been on New Zealand's reaction to what's happened. And I think it's very important. I would like New Zealand, Mr. Peters at times has said absolutely the right thing. He said quite early on, there's no military solution to this. But he should be saying that out loud more. Why? Because Netanyahu boasts that he has blocked a two-state solution for 25 years. But in blocking a two-state solution, what's that mean, blocking a two-state solution? Well, what he's saying to all Palestinians are, you do not have the right to political self-determination. That plays well with his constituency who want to, maybe they want to create a greater Israel at the expense of West Bank and Gaza. But in the long run, it doesn't make Israel's situation more secure. In short, it's folly to believe that a military approach can be a substitute for a political solution which must involve at some point recognition that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. It was John Kennedy, I think in 1957 when he was a senator, who once said, with respect to the debates going on about decolonisation, and he was talking about Algeria, and he was being critical of the French government, and Kennedy said something quite insightful, and he said, if you block the prospect for a peaceful path to political self-determination, extremism and terrorism and violence will surely follow. And unfortunately, this is what is so, I think, depressing for many of us observing what's happening at the moment.
Thank you, Robert, for raising the question of the UN Security Council. It needs reform, but do we have the tools? What are the tools?
Well, you don't get if you don't ask. Thank you very much for your question. It's excellent. And I do believe the smaller and middle powers can play a significant role in ratcheting this issue up. There is in 2012, when Mr. Macaulay, then New Zealand's foreign minister, made a speech, I've never forgotten this, it was you can watch it on YouTube if you want, New Zealand was limbering up for its bid to try and get on the UN Security Council. The Labour government of 2007 had decided that New Zealand should try and get on the Security Council. The new government that came in, elected government of John Key, agreed. And in 2012, the process was accelerated. These things take a long time. And Mark Macaulay made a bit of a campaign speech in the General Assembly in September 2012. And he started talking in his speech about what New Zealand could bring to the UN Security Council. And he said, almost as an aside, we'd like to constrain the use of the veto. Before the words got out of his mouth, he got a standing ovation. There is enormous frustration internationally. And that's where I think we could be pushing on an open door if New Zealand, I'm not suggesting New Zealand does it unilaterally, but New Zealand could act as a bit of an entrepreneur of ideas, a bit of a playmaker, And it would be fulfilling Peter Fraser's vision, in my view, of New Zealand being a constructive and concerned international citizen. Most countries are enormously frustrated. Australia is just as frustrated in many respects by the veto as we are. And Canada is. The Europeans are. We have this extraordinary situation at the moment where certain countries, well, let's be quite clear. Who has the veto? It's the US, Russia, China, the UK and France. And those countries, they use the veto to protect their national interests. No one else can do that. So what does that mean? It means they can block anything internationally they don't like. But the problem is, they can't put anything, they can block a solution. The United States could exercise the veto 5 times to prevent a ceasefire in Gaza. But it couldn't impose its own ceasefire. And so we're falling between 2 stools. The veto is there to protect the interests of great powers, but great powers can't do what the founders of the UN expected them to do, which is solve the problems for us. So we've got the worst of both worlds. We lack international solutions, and the bigger powers can't impose their own. And my answer to your question is, I do think it's an issue where New Zealand should be playing a role, and we should not give up on it. Because let's be quite clear, it's not just Gaza. Look at the ridiculous situation around Ukraine. Look at the Syrian situation in 2011. The Obama administration tried 3 times to get a resolution in the UN Security Council to halt the escalating civil war in Syria. Russia and China both vetoed it. What was the US proposal, which was floated 3 times, 3 separate resolutions, was for the Assad regime to stand down, for there to be democratic elections to head off the prospect of civil war. Now, yes, it would be difficult. But of course, Russia said no because they had a strategic base and they liked Assad. They liked dealing with a dictatorship. So it's not just Gaza, and you look at the situation in Ukraine, the absurdity of a situation where Russia can invade another country. It virtually ripped up the UN Charter in doing so. 2 key principles of international relations are respect for state sovereignty, respect for territorial integrity. Russia showed no respect on either of those principles, and what's more, it was able to block in the UN Security Council a resolution condemning their invasion. It's an extraordinary situation. How long are the rest going to put up with it? Because it is the rest that are paying the price for this privilege. At the moment, as I speak to you, matters of war and peace on this planet rest on the shoulders of just 5 countries. As one German diplomat said to me not so long ago, the 3 biggest lawbreakers, they're all permanent members of the Security Council. He was referring, of course, to the United States, Russia and China. So, you know, I definitely believe this is something that New Zealand should set its sights on. And by the way, I can, you know, when I've said this before to another audience, someone said to me, "Oh, Patman, you're so naive, typical academic. You're living in an ivory tower." Of course they're not going to give up their veto. My response to that is twofold. They're not going to give it up if they're not asked to, but maybe we don't have to ask them to give it up. I argued in the South China Morning Post, I think it was in November 2023, that actually there could be a rule change in which if 2/3 of the General Assembly members vote for a resolution, and remember at the moment I should explain, the key decision-making body in the United Nations Security Council is the key body, the UN Security Council, because its resolutions are binding. The UN General Assembly, which is representative of all the states, its resolutions are non-binding. But you could introduce a rule, and this is where I think New Zealand could play a real role, whereby if a resolution is passed in the General Assembly and it has more than 2/3 support, that can overrule any veto by any individual UN Security Council member. So you're not actually putting them on the spot and say you've got to give up your veto. You're actually tweaking the situation where their veto is by definition constrained. And that seems to me, there are ways of doing things, and it seems to me it's defeatist just to accept the current situation.
We can take one more question, and then brief question, brief response.
Just a short note to contrast Longy's problem and the problem of a schizophrenic, vindictive Trump who slaps on tariffs. But my main question, especially in this setting, is about what's happening with your figures about the stark contrast, the asymmetry between the Palestinian losses and the Israeli losses. Also, the 101 multiplier, while the Israelis can justify killing 100 civilians to get one Hamas member. Now, the founding pillar in this place, remember, of Judaism is an eye for an eye, adopted to stop multiplier violence and the consequences. What's happening now in Gaza is appalling. 60% of the members of Hamas are orphans from previous Israeli outrages. So is this just a great factory, as you mentioned before, to generate even more problems for Israel in the long term? And how will that go down in neighbouring Arab countries with the American pressure on them?
Thank you very much for your excellent question. It's often, your question draws attention to it, it's often forgotten that both Hamas and Hezbollah were created through Israeli, first of all in the case of Hezbollah, Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. And Hezbollah arose as a resistance front to Israeli incursion. And then Hamas, 1987, also developed as a response to Israel occupation. And, you know, I'm not in any way condoning Hezbollah or Hamas. I mean, I thought it was an incredibly... Hamas must have known that Netanyahu would react to some degree, particularly some of the colleagues he has in his government, Smotrich, and I think it was it the president of Israel said there were no innocent Palestinians. He said that on the 8th of... That created a climate in which it's highly likely there was going to be no distinction between civilians and Hamas militants. And so, yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's been this lack of calibration, the way the thing has been, lack of proportion of the Israeli response is really counterproductive, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I think the stage is set for more confrontation. You mentioned one point I would like to just raise. I'm thinking of writing, if I get a chance, I'll try and write an op-ed on this one, but I probably won't get a chance for a while. But the role of the Arab countries. I mean, I think I've been saying to you tonight, I've been quite disheartened by the limp-wristed response of liberal democracies. But the response of the Arab countries to the plight of the Palestinians, fellow Arabs, I find this baffling. I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia actually has the ability, if it wished to seriously challenge the blockade of humanitarian food. And we saw with the Soviet blockade of Berlin that blockades can be resisted. Airlifts. But I suppose the answer to the question which you hinted at about the stance of the Arab countries to these situations, Qatar has been an effective mediator. and has worked very hard. But, you know, it's very disappointing that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, countries like this, they really, if they took a public stand against what was happening, it would be significant. And they haven't. They've kept their heads down. And that is very regrettable and has probably prolonged what's gone on, unfortunately.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been fed a veritable feast. A big feast, much more than maybe some of us had thought we would ever get. There's been a lot of thought in both the questions and a huge amount of thought in the delivery of the initial speech and the answers given by Robert. So it's at this moment, I wish to give you a little gift, Robert.
Well, thank you. It wasn't necessary. Thank you. Thanks, George. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. We look forward to the next piece, which is in... in August. Murray Ray is speaking. So that will be posted on the internet and publicised elsewhere as well. Thank you again.